In a nightmarish future where youth violence runs rampant, 15-year-old Alex leads his gang of droogs through brutal acts of ultraviolence. But when the state intervenes with a controversial new method of rehabilitation, Alex finds himself stripped of choice and of his own humanity. At once shocking and darkly prescient, A Clockwork Orange is Anthony Burgess's disturbing reflection on free will, morality, and the terrifying plausibility of state control. Few authors have explored the paradoxes of free will as consistently and insightfully as Anthony Burgess. Across his novels, one question echoes of increasing urgency. How does one live as a free individual against the general intrusions and indignities of the modern world? Free of influence, free of compromise, free of abuse and exploitation, and above all else for Burgess, whose Catholicism was formative and deeply ingrained, free of sin.
What's all this about sin?
It's a question asked by the cantankerous poet Francis Xavier Enderby in the masterful comic tragedy Inside Mr. Enderby, as the ailing wordsmith sits atop the lavatorial throne of his run-down bedsit, composing another barbed verse as he watches old manuscripts moulder away in great stacks, piled high inside an empty bathtub. It's a question asked by the academic Tristram Fox and his wife Beatrice Joanna in the darkly dystopic The Wanting Seed, one of the author's most pitiless and problematic works. And it's a question asked by the unethical MI6 agent Dennis Hillier, as the hapless spy finds himself trapped behind enemy lines and consigned to a parodic purgatory of gluttonous excesses and joyless abuses of the flesh in Tremor of Intent, a bewildering burlesque of the typical James Bond adventure story. However, it's here, in his 1962 novella, A Clockwork Orange, that Burgess's probing of the nature and even fragility of free will receives its most potent dramatization. In the story, our protagonist Alex, a teenage delinquent failed by the system and spiraling into ever-worsening acts of criminality and violence, finds himself at the mercy of various controlling institutions which attempt to make and remake the boy for their own nefarious intents. As the character narrates his complicated journey from ultra-violence and institutional abuse to his eventual hard-won maturity and something approaching social conformity, Burgess underlines the book's philosophical and spiritual inquiry. What is the cost of goodness if goodness is coerced? Burgess's critique here isn't confined to the juvenile justice system. Through Alex's journey, the novel challenges a host of social institutions, family, school, government, religion, all of which fail to foster genuine moral development. Instead, these forces impose their own conflicting agendas, often exploiting vulnerable individuals already shaped by inequality and neglect. The novel in this sense becomes a searing indictment of a world where morality is legislated, not chosen, where people are shaped not by grace, but by external and often systemic pressures. Though often placed alongside dystopian classics like 1984 by George Orwell, or Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury, A Clockwork Orange is perhaps more closely aligned with something like The Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan. Like The Pilgrim's Progress, Burgess's book is, at its core, a kind of spiritual allegory, one focused on the theme of moral and spiritual transformation. Alex's journey from a state of depravity to self-awareness and finally to renunciation mirrors Christian notions of fall and redemption. Of course, Alex is certainly no Christ figure. However, there is a clear appeal to martyrdom in his enforced suffering. And, like the faithful in Bunyan's earlier tale, the young Alex must traverse his own valley of torment before he can glimpse salvation and eventually resurrection. What makes Burgess's take on this theme so radical is that Alex must arrive at redemption not through punishment, but through choice. For Burgess, free will, even if it leads to evil, is still preferable to virtue imposed by surgery, force, or psychological conditioning. In one of the book's most quoted passages, Burgess himself writes, "If he can only perform good, or only perform evil, then he is a clockwork orange," meaning that he has the appearance of an organism, lovely with colour and juice, but is in fact only a clockwork toy to be wound up by God or the devil. The significance of the book's ending in this context is one of the many reasons why I find Burgess's book preferable to its celebrated 1971 film adaptation by Stanley Kubrick. While undoubtedly brilliant in many respects, the film adaptation has always fallen short for me. In adapting the book, Kubrick famously chose to follow the US publication of the novel, which omits Burgess's original final chapter. The film ends not with Alex's growing realization that he wants more from life than violence and criminality, but with a chilling return to form. "I was cured all right," he sneers sarcastically in voiceover, as the film cuts to its closing titles. In doing so, Kubrick removes the idea that people can change, not because they are forced to, but because they choose to. As such, the film reinforces the idea that good and evil as characteristics are somehow hardwired or inherently ingrained, and not, as Burgess rightly suggests, circumstantial, shaped as they often are by factors like our environment, upbringing, and the political systems that can either support or exploit us. Kubrick's film has since become a genuine touchstone of science fiction cinema, its acclaim often eclipsing that of the novel itself. Among certain cinephiles, the film is frequently held up as a rare example of a film that outshines its original source material, being spoken of in the same breath as works like The Godfather by Francis Ford Coppola or Jaws by Steven Spielberg, films that are likely better than the book from which they were adapted. However, for all its bold, distinctive iconography and the dazzling musicality of the film, which more than complements the director's faithful appropriation of Burgess's incredible dialogue, Kubrick's adaptation, in my opinion, misses so much of what makes the book so vital and terrifying. Chief among the film's problems for me is its casting. Malcolm McDowell delivers an admittedly brave and charismatic performance as Alex. However, he's too old for the part. In the book, Alex is a child, a detail that is not incidental, but crucial to the book's psychology. The dissonance between innocence and evil in a 15-year-old boy creates a certain moral complexity. Casting older actors, while necessary for Kubrick to indulge in his more salacious taste for gratuitous scenes of sexuality, reduces the ambiguity of Alex's own agency, while at the same time softening the more important moral dilemma faced by the reader. Worse perhaps, the film flattens much of the book's pointed political commentary. In the book, Alex is tossed between satirical versions of both left and right-wing ideologies, each side vying in their efforts to exploit the child for political propaganda. In this dialectical back and forth between veiled parodies of both the state and the opposition, Burgess mocks both liberal permissiveness and authoritarian regulation, showing how each side creates and then destroys its own monsters for political ends. This is the very mechanism the title refers to, the clockwork, the artificial pattern imposed on something that should, like humanity, be organic and free. The film also sidelines many of the book's key events, focusing too much time on the sensationalism of Alex's life of criminality, and less so on the sobering reality of incarceration and the exploitation of Alex by the state. The violence in the first half of Kubrick's film is portrayed as a kind of grotesque ballet, giddy, almost feverish in its fast-cutting and disquieting use of pop art iconography, as the thieving magpie of Rossini provides a near-constant soundtrack of playful mischief. In contrast, Alex's later suffering is filmed with a chilly, wide-angle detachment, the soundtrack replaced by the distorted, abstracted electronics of Wendy Carlos. In the book, Burgess places equal moral weight on both the violence Alex commits and the violence later inflicted upon him by the state and those who come to hate what he represents. Nonetheless, Kubrick should be commended for maintaining the novel's astonishing use of language. The dialogue here is defined by Alex's use of nadsat, a blend of Russian, Cockney rhyming slang, and a made-up Polari invented by Burgess himself. The result of this very specific and uncharacteristic approach to dialogue can often be immersive, disorienting, even musical. It forces the reader into a position of complicity. To understand Alex, we must first learn to speak like him. In this sense, the book becomes not just a narrative, but a linguistic experience, where the reader is immediately recruited as a kind of co-conspirator, implicated in Alex's reminiscence of crime and punishment through our shared understanding of this almost private language. The musicality of the text isn't accidental here. Burgess was a trained composer, and the rhythmic cadences of his Nadsat language mirror the symphonic structures of classical music, something Alex himself adores. This tension between beauty and brutality, between art and the art of violence, lies at the novel's moral centre, as it does in the contradictions of humanity itself. Today, A Clockwork Orange remains as urgent and insightful as ever. In 2025, with the UK's Labour government announcing plans to trial chemical castration in 20 prisons, Burgess's warning against the mechanisation of morality feels chillingly prescient. As a culture, are we any closer to resolving the tension between justice and freedom, between protection and autonomy? Or are we still winding up clockwork toys? Burgess's answer to this is clear. Redemption, if it is to mean anything, must come through choice, not programming. And even the worst among us must retain the possibility of grace.